Hey folks, this is Kelani. One thing that's been very popular in my guild recently is pointing out something that Classic WoW did better, only for someone else to chime in with something else that Classic did terribly. With the summer fast approaching, we'll all be able to form our own opinions on the real vanilla experience once again in no time. Was everything just nostalgia? Will vanilla work in the integrated digital age that we evolved into? Will everyone find a rekindled love for the game because we see how things used to be? Maybe, maybe not. Only time will tell, but these little jabs back and forth did get me thinking. We've come a very long way from where we used to be. Sometimes it's 2 steps forwards, 1 step back, other times it feels like 1 step forward and a few miles back. But something that stuck out to me was how dungeons remain relevant in the current age of World of Warcraft. Back before Legion, dungeons fizzled out as they always have done. They provide you with an early gearing up path when an expansion is new and fresh, and they're usually pigeonholed into a weekly or daily reward system to keep players going back when they no longer need the actual gear. More dungeons were typically added into the game as raids were released to give us some semblance of 5-man content that stayed relevant as new raid tiers were released. But when Mythic Plus was introduced, that was really the first time you could say dungeons were viable end-game content. Dungeons are still quite different when compared to raids though. With dungeons you had the same setup, the same encounters, and mostly the same progression paths through them at the start of the expansion and at the end of the expansion. They're not going to change all that much in the grand scheme of things, whereas new raid tiers are some of the most exciting pieces of content in the entire game. They come around more often than new dungeons, they're large-scale encounters, and they typically drop some awesome super special loot. Now, seasonal affixes should help with this a little bit. Changing up the plus 10 affix should help switch things up in the dungeon overall. Reaping definitely plays very differently when compared to Infested, for example, so they're doing a great job there so far. It's also pretty interesting that you can push and push and push until those keys are harder than the mythic difficulty of the current raid tier. But it's not just the challenge or the difficulty which has remained relevant as the expansions unfold. Dungeons are now also a fantastic source of loot for pretty much everyone, whether you're raiding Mythic or not. I think Mythic Plus is a wonderful addition to the game for all of these reasons, but part of me is concerned that it might have gone a little bit too far. Most items don't really matter all that much in the grand scheme of things, at least in Battle for Azeroth. Your typical slot pieces, things like boots and belts and gloves, they're just stat sticks at the end of the day, right? If you want a piece of gear with specific stats on it, you can probably find it without looking too hard. If the current raid tier doesn't drop your perfect stats, you can still hope for that to drop from Mythic Plus dungeons that you're probably already running every week to get another chance at shiny loot from the weekly Mythic Plus cache. But having your best in slot items come from a dungeon instead of the new raid still feels a little weird, especially when that new raid tier has just opened up. Going into every raid tier since the start of Legion, so the Battle of Dazar'alor was no exception, looking through the boss loot tables you usually have one of 2 reactions. Oh sweet, this boss drops my best in slot braces. Or, these braces don't have my best stats, so I guess I'm back to farming Waycrest mana over and over again until I get a decent drop. It's incredibly polarized and often feels pretty bad when you get a piece of loot from the raid that you know isn't ideal because dungeons offer up gear so freely these days and you can get the right stats you want because it's just a stat stick. But that's just for the offset pieces, if that's what you want to call them. When it comes to Azurite Armor, which is supposed to be the stuff that you get really excited about, I think they actually managed to create a fairly even playing field at this point. Azurite Armor itself can't drop from Mythic Plus dungeons, so the stuff available from the raid is always going to have an edge when compared to anything else because of the item level bump. That means when a new piece drops and it's an item level upgrade, the chances of you equipping it right away and rejoicing for the DPS or healing bump is fairly high, especially with the addition of that extra outer ring, which gives you so many more chances to get an Azurite trait you actually care about. After a few weeks have passed in a new raid tier or a new season, you should be able to gather up enough residuum to buy a token from the vendor there too. So you have multiple avenues for acquiring that gear, but raid tiers will always have some value because you get the higher item level rewards from raids faster and earlier than you can for the dungeon equivalent. But this falls very short when you look at something like Trinkets. This is the main thing I want to talk about here, because I think it's probably the most frustrating piece of gear to really be happy about unless you get insanely lucky. The first problem is dungeon trinkets. Some of them are just way too good, which seems like a bit of an odd thing to be complaining about, but some of these trinkets are so good that unless they introduce some mandatory trinkets like they did for Antorus back in Legion, we're going to be farming the same trinkets over and over and over again. If you're a caster, you're probably interested in the Conch from Shrine of the Storm, or the Mage Fuse from Tol de Gore. If you're an agility user, you probably know Freehold as well as the back of your hand, trying to get your hands on a pair of super dice. So that's the first thing, but the second problem is raid trinkets. Most of them just aren't that great. There's a few out there for sure, and it's better in Desert Lore than it was in Uldir. I still remember people groaning and moaning if they got the Gahun trinket because it was terrible for almost everybody. That just seems bad, right? You should never complain that you get a piece of gear, but in Desert Lore you have the Paku Haste trinket, the Kimball Bleed trinket, healers have the Ward or the Mirror, which can be decent, and the one that a lot of people seem to be after is the Incandescent Sliver. That trinket is the bane of our offices, or a few of them anyway, because people want to set up different stack points for different people, and it causes a few headaches whenever it's brought up, but at least it's semi-interesting while you're on farm, and you can sneak out of the group every now and then to make sure you've got that full stack. But no matter how interesting trinkets are, if they don't compete when it comes to the raw numbers, hardly anyone will really care. The people at the top of the theory chains will figure out what's best, and anyone who doesn't bother doing their own legwork will follow along with what they say. So everyone ends up going after the same trinkets, and if the best trinkets just and so happen to be from dungeons, then I guess that's where we'll spend our time. But the third, and perhaps the most important issue here, is Titan Forging. Raids start with a bit of a leg up. Their base item level is higher than any other source of gear in the game. That means if you're clearing Mythic Desert Lore, you'll be seeing some very high item level drops, and the item level difference between your Mythic Raid trinket and an item level 400 trinket from a dungeon suddenly means quite a bit more. 15 item levels is a lot. Chances are your higher item level trinket will win out. Sometimes that's not the case, but that just means the dev team really messed up somewhere with 0.1 and 0.2, but for everything else it wouldn't be crazy to think that the higher item level piece of gear wins the numbers game. But then you bring Titan Forging into the equation, and suddenly anything from dungeons can keep up with mythic raids and even go beyond mythic raids. It seems to work against new raid tiers almost. If my best dungeon trinket is still better than any trinkets coming out of the new raid, suddenly one of the most exciting parts of a new raid doesn't really mean anything, and the dungeon gear is far more accessible when compared to raid gear too, so the chances of getting a high Titan Forged dungeon piece is actually way higher than a high mythic raid piece, even if you do start with that extra 15 item levels with the raid stuff. With it being on a weekly lockout, you only get that one chance, but for dungeons you can go again and again and again as many times as you want, as long as you have the appropriate keys. So the chances of seeing a 425 socketed dungeon trinket are way higher than seeing a 425 socketed raid trinket. If the dungeon trinket is already ahead of the raid trinket, that just makes the choice even more obvious. Personally, I would love to see a limit introduced for Titan Forging. Having a normal raid piece or a Mythic 2 dungeon piece Titan Forge past a Mythic raid piece is pretty bonkers. Capping Titan Forging at plus 15 item levels of the base, something like that, would go a long way to making sure that a brief stroke of luck doesn't completely slingshot your rewards way past the content you're actually doing. But perhaps more importantly, it gives you a proper sense of power progression. This problem might not be limited to trinkets going forward though. The new raid coming in just over 2 weeks, the Crucible of Storms, is doing something a little quirky with its loot drops. Every single item has a special effect, whether it be your staff, your pair of gloves, or even your belt. Everything does something special, so it's kind of like everything being a trinket, but I think the dev team may have decided to do this in the wrong way. Instead of these effects being bonuses on top of your usual piece of gear, they're trying to balance it by removing secondary stats. So a pair of legs that is designed to increase your throughput will only have one secondary stat instead of two. That means you're automatically comparing all of these potentially really cool effects to raw, passive stat gains and numbers. I think it might have been a better idea to just add those effects on top of the usual secondary stat values. Yes, that means anytime you have a throughput specific effect, it's going to make that item better by default than whatever came from Desert Lore or from dungeons. And that's fine. It's okay to have powerful items, especially when it's a dinky 2-boss raid that is tacked on the end of another raid tier. That makes the loot special. It makes this loot exciting. But they didn't do that, so we're back to the same problem we have with trinkets. What's actually pretty funny to me is that when I went through these items on the PTR a few weeks ago, some of the effects seemed pretty decent, while others seemed fairly mediocre overall, but the main point that I tried to get across is that with this gear being the same item level as the loot from the Battle of Desert Lore raid, I doubted many of the effects could make up for the loss of passive stats. Well, a week or so ago, the item levels were bumped up, so the first boss drops items which are 5 eye levels above Desert Lore, and the second boss drops gear which is 10 item levels above Desert Lore, which means that Mythic Crucible of Storms will drop 425 gear right smack on the Titan Forging cap, and we do know for sure now that the Titan Forging cap won't change at all because of this, so gear from that second boss won't be able to Titan Forge at all. So they knew this gear might not be enticing enough without an item level bump. I'm glad they went ahead with it. That makes this loot a little more exciting no matter how you look at it. It's a higher item level, a higher power level, but I'm still really curious to see how these effects compare to our standard loot. I think it's a bit of a shame because I love where they decided to go with the loot for the Crucible of Storms. Some of these effects are a bit wacky, some of them seem quite powerful no matter how you look at it, while others are fairly bland overall, but at least they're trying to change things up. Some of the most iconic items in the game were the ones which had powerful or special effects that dropped alongside your regular run-of-the-mill loot, so I hope they continue this trend of trying special effects on raid gear as we head down into Nazjatar and eventually face off against Queen Azurite. I do think that trying to balance these effects by removing secondary stats is still a mistake, especially in a raid tier where we had a lot of passive stats anyway. Special effects are cool and all, but the end game of WoW will always be a numbers game. If the effects don't add up, they won't see any use. I do hope we see some powerful items, specifically powerful trinkets from some of the future raid tiers, powerful enough to let us forget about Harlan's Dice or the Conch of Dark Whispers, even if it's just for a single raid tier. I don't know, talking about this kind of thing feels weird too. It's like I'm complaining that we can get good gear from dungeons, which isn't really what I'm trying to say. Maybe it would be better if the dungeon trinkets weren't so good for so many classes, or maybe the raid trinkets just need an extra bit of love so it's actually more exciting when they do drop. It just seems odd for a weekly lockout to be less rewarding than a spammable source of loot. But I've been rambling on for a bit too long at this point. What do you think of the current loot situation with dungeons and raids? Do you think raids should always offer the best loot in the game? What do you think of the effects on the new gear from the Crucible of Storms and trading secondary stats for them? Leave all your thoughts in the comments section below. A big thank you to all of our supporters over on Patreon. You can see their names floating by on screen. If you want to join these lovely guys and gals, you can find a link in the description below. Remember to leave a like just below the video before you leave, and if you want to see more, make sure to subscribe. But apart from that, thanks for watching folks, good luck and have fun, and as always I will see you next time.